moving trillions of dollars each year, government shutdowns, debt ceiling debates. The US federal budget process is high politics par excellence. But the detailed annual process, from the first whispers of proposals in the executive branch over the drafting in Congress all the way to the final appropriations and then expenditure by an agency, largely operates outside the public eye. I'll go through some of that today so that you can get a feel for the actors involved, their powers, and what they are trying to accomplish. While nowadays the blueprint for each budget comes from the White House, historically federal agencies, including departments, used to submit their budget requests directly to Congress. This disorganized and decentralized process was overturned in 1921 with the Budget and Accounting Act. The act created what is now called the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, within the Executive Office of the President, EOP, and obliged the President, who is not mentioned in the context of the budget in the Constitution, to submit the yearly budget to Congress, meaning agencies would from then on submit their request to the President first rather than Congress. The executive branch sandwiches Congress in the budget process by producing the first draft of the budget and then overseeing the implementation at the end. The OMB is the largest office within the EOP at around 500 staff involved in the policy-relevant work, but that is probably understaffed given its large and important portfolio. Next to creating the first budget draft, it also evaluates costs and effectiveness of various agencies' policies. It is something like an internal auditor for the executive branch. It oversees all regulations passed by the independent rulemaking agencies. It vets all communication, proposals, and congressional testimony, for example, going from the executive branch to Congress to be aligned with the White House. And in the other direction, it vets all legislative proposals that reach the President's desk and append a sign or veto recommendation according to the President's policy priorities. The OMB is the whip in the President's hand when he faces the executive branch. While it consists of various offices for different tasks that I may go into in a future video, relevant to the budget process are the resource management offices. About half of all OMB staff work here. Almost all career civil servants except the heads of each of 5 portfolios, for example health or national security. Those heads are called the Program Associate Directors, or PADs. These are political appointees that, unlike the director of the OMB, do not require Senate confirmation. Beneath the PADs are the DADs, the Deputy Associate Directors. These are career civil servants running the divisions each RMO is divided into. Below that are branches with branch chiefs managing program examiners that oversee parts of large departments or several small agencies. The RMOs have most control over those agencies that operate through spending programs like HHS, but less over those that mostly do regulation like the SEC. Those are controlled by OIRA within OMB. RMOs restrict what agencies may disclose about the budget process to outside entities like Congress or the media, ensuring consistency with the President's presented budget, often requiring agency officials to publicly support the final budget even if they initially advocated for different policies. This rules out the agencies lobbying Congress independently behind the back of OMB. So let's look at how that presidential budget proposal is made. Regarding the budget process, OMB evaluates the competing funding demands from different parts of the executive branch and then forces the President's funding priorities in the initial budget draft. This intra-executive process before we reach Congress takes up to a year. While the fiscal year begins on October 1st of year X and Congress receives the President's proposal in February of that year X, the executive branch's preparation phase starts approximately 18 months prior to the beginning of the fiscal year, around April of calendar year X-1. So step by step. First, the OMB briefs the President of the overall economic situation and forecasts fiscal possibilities. The White House decides on funding priorities, and the OMB sends out so-called spring guidance memos to all agencies that communicate these priorities they should consider when making their budget requests for the next fiscal year. Recall that the new budget was passed around half a year ago by Congress at this point. Since ultimately the President will sign off on the budget proposal, the agencies have nothing to gain by making requests completely contrary to his policy goals. The OMB sets deadlines and continually coordinates with the executive branch. Secondly, some months later, around July, the OMB circulates the only letter whose name you may want to remember, the OMB Circular A11. This is the comprehensive document instructing all federal executive agencies on how to submit their formal budget proposals later in September. That is still a year ahead of when the budget is passed, and it incorporates both White House policy preferences and the information gathered in the last couple of months. Thirdly, after formal proposals have been submitted by September, the OMB starts its review process lasting through October and November. OMB makes sure the math is mathing, policy priorities are appropriately funded or not funded, and OMB staff meet with senior agency representatives to iron out the details. Fourthly, the director of the OMB meets with the president and so forth and presents the budget proposal. Any trade-offs and final decisions that couldn't be made at a lower level will take place here. This is reminiscent of the NSC, appealing controversial issues upwards. See, for example, my other videos on the NSC. In December, agencies are formally notified of the decisions regarding their requests, and they can submit appeals if they believe they were unfairly shorted. This only makes sense if they can make the argument that some of their spending is actually aligned with the president's policy priorities and was overlooked in the process. That is not on its face unreasonable, since a lot of spending will involve fairly technical details with difficult to understand outcomes. The OMB or the president may have just gotten it wrong. There may also be the temptation for agencies to simply always ask for more money, but to what extent that actually is the case and what motivates that is a more complicated story than I want to get into here. Finally, once all appeals have been worked through and a proposal has been finalized, so-called budget justification documents are created by OMB together with the agencies. They are basically what they say on the tin. They explain the reasoning, including the policy priorities that went into each agency's budget. This is intended for the Congressional committees working on the budget in the next step. By the first Monday in February, the president should submit his budget proposal to Congress, who can entirely ignore it if they so choose, since Congress ultimately controls spending. Since the president has to approve Congress's decisions at the end, they do well not to just ignore his proposals. The veto is a fairly blunt instrument though, so the proposal's main power comes through public opinion. The proposal coincides with the State of the Union address, but also just the force of its argument. It is intricately detailed and incorporates arguments from many different experts. Congress does well to listen to the president's proposal over any other statement of opinion on where the money should go, because no one else has this much information and has invested this much effort into their recommendations. What currently happens in Congress when it passes a budget is downstream of the changes introduced with the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, or Budget Act, or CBA for short. This act gave Congress more power in the budget process in general. It, for example, established the budget committees in both chambers and the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, to provide numbers independent of the OMB. The benefit of the procedures introduced by the Budget Act is that the Senate limited itself in terms of debate time and only allows germane, that means relevant, amendments. Most of what follows below cannot be filibustered, and the Senate procedures regarding the budget are therefore as majoritarian as the regular House procedures. What follows is the most complicated part in the whole budget process. The first actors entering the stage are the two budget committees who will pass a concurrent resolution, simply called the budget resolution. While this resolution needs to be passed by both chambers and will usually reach a conference committee, this is not a law and it is not signed by the president. The budget resolution is meant for the budget work internally and represents Congress's general view of what the new budget should look like. How do the budget committees decide that though? The budget committees hold hearings where they receive so-called views and estimates reports from the other committees where they outline their legislative plans and what they think they'll need in terms of funding. There is the presidential proposal they will work off of, and the committee can hold hearings with agency heads like secretaries and the director of the OMB. The budget committees also obtain information from the CBO, like projections of the budgetary and economic outlook and analysis of the president's budget proposal. The Joint Committee on Taxation also prepares estimates of the budgetary impact of legislation. The final budget resolution this hearing process produces contains total revenues, total new spending authority, the deficit or surplus, and the level of new debt. This is further split into functional categories like health or national security, specified in the Budget Act. The spending and revenues of the parts must ultimately sum to the overall spending and revenues. Note that the budget resolution does not allocate funds to specific programs or accounts. It allocates total spending to substantive committees with spending jurisdiction, like the House Committee on Energy and Commerce or the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor and Pensions. I say substantive committee because these committees deal with questions of actual policy programs rather than just money. The budget resolution does not actually bind those substantive committees, even though it allocates funds to their jurisdiction that they can spread over old or new programs according to the committee members' subject matter expertise. It binds the Appropriations Committee that we will meet later in the process. To give a specific example, rather than binding the committee dealing with defense to a certain spending limit, the budget resolution of, for example, the House binds the subcommittee on the House Appropriations Committee doing the appropriations for defense to that limit. To influence the substantive committees, the Budget Committee uses another tool. By tradition since 1980, the budget resolution will also contain what are called reconciliation instructions. The name comes from the fact that the original process outlined in the 1974 Act contained two budget resolutions that needed to be reconciled. Today, reconciliation bills don't reconcile anything anymore. A so-called reconciliation bill is now just any bill ordered by a budget resolution to meet fiscal targets. For example, the resolution might order the House Committee on Energy and Commerce to propose changes to laws that will cut spending by $1 billion, or it might order Ways and Means to increase taxes to reduce the deficit by $3 billion. The next actors are the substantive committees already mentioned. These are what you think of when you hear Congressional Committee. The collections of congresspersons writing legislation on different topics: defense, taxes, healthcare, social security, financial regulations, agriculture, and so on. An example taken directly from the Oleszek source is that the committee dealing with agriculture may authorize the Secretary of Agriculture to purchase pulse crops, meaning beans and lentils, for the use in federal school lunch programs and also to conduct evaluations of that program. Typically, this will include recommendations for how much spending should be appropriated for this cause, but that is merely a guidance for the Appropriations Committee and not legally binding. All programs the executive branch wants to run require such an act authorizing it. Nowadays, to enforce more congressional control over agencies and as a way for the substantive committees to take power from the Appropriations Committee, authorizations are periodic rather than permanent. Every couple of years usually, Congress will have to authorize each program again. Permanent authorizations remain until changed by Congress. For example, the Library of Congress is financed by a permanent authorization. These substantive committees will do the nitty-gritty work of cutting or modifying programs to meet the directives in the reconciliation instructions given to them by the Budget Committee. That makes sense to me, since they have much more policy knowledge than any other actor in Congress, at least. All of these bills from all of the instructed committees go back to the House or Senate Budget Committee, and that committee will package them into what is called an omnibus reconciliation bill. This is just for procedural efficiency. Now the entire thing can be considered at once, rather than considering each reconciliation bill individually. This bill has to make its way through Congress like a regular bill, with the benefit that because of the Budget Act, it cannot be filibustered or amended by unrelated nonsense in the Senate. This makes reconciliation an attractive target for controversial legislation that might not otherwise pass the Senate's supermajority requirements. There are statutory limits to what can be included in reconciliation bills, though. You may hear about the Byrd rule in this context. Byrd like B-Y-R-D. The final actor in the Congressional Budget Trinity, after the Budget Committee and the Substantive Committees, are the two extremely powerful Appropriations Committees. Before an agency can start spending the money the Substantive Committees has intended for some of its programs, for essentially no good reason that needs to be approved again by those Appropriations Committees. The reason is supposed to be that the members of Substantive Committees can develop subject matter expertise without worrying about costs and spending. That's a fair concern and should be dismissed immediately. With 12 subcommittees, the Appropriations Committees have the most of any congressional committee in both chambers. Most other standing committees typically have around 4 to 7 subcommittees. This number is not legally fixed and in fact has changed this century. The subcommittees correspond to the 12 appropriations bills that are written each year, split thematically, for example defense or homeland security or interior and environment. These bills simply list the amount of money to be spent on the things specified, with reference to an authorizing act by a substantive committee where applicable. At first glance, these appropriations committees may seem infinitely powerful, at least in restricting the executive government. They face a ceiling set by the Budget Committee, but they could appropriate $0, for example, for defense spending, irrespective of the policies the Substantive Committee on Defense or even the President has thought of. But appropriations only concern around a third of federal spending, namely discretionary spending, which is just exactly that type of spending controlled by appropriations. The 2/3 that are mandatory or direct spending, on the other hand, are controlled by the substantive committees. The costs of entitlement programs like Medicare are controlled by eligibility standards and levels of benefits that are defined by the substantive committee, not the appropriations committee. In any case, during the budget process, the 12 appropriations subcommittees will hold hearings with agency heads and budget officials, digging into the line item expenditures they asked for in the President's proposal or that made it into the reconciliation bills prepared by the relevant substantive committee. The appropriations subcommittees will always consider the specific limits set by the budget committee for their particular jurisdiction. Recall that it is these guys who are actually bound by the budget resolution. This detailed committee work is always called markup, also for regular bills that don't have anything to do with the budget. Appropriations bills are not like reconciliation bills or the budget resolution in that they still go through the ordinary legislative procedure and can therefore be filibustered in the Senate. The appropriations bills often get bundled together into larger omnibus bills. This packaging in reality is done by high-ranking politicians like party leadership, committee chairs, and White House officials, and the result represents a high-level political compromise negotiated essentially outside of Congress without input by rank-and-file members. Ideally, the appropriations bills are the thing that should get passed before the 1st of October, when the new fiscal year starts. The final actor involved is the President, who has to sign the appropriations bills. If he didn't sign, that would be a veto. Nowadays, though, that deadline is regularly missed. This necessitates what are called continuing resolutions that basically do what they say. They carry forward old appropriations and don't allow for program changes, but keep the government liquid in the absence of a proper appropriations bill. Currently, in fiscal year 2025, The US government operates under a full-year continuing resolution extending the 2024 budget rather than regular appropriations bills. In times of divided government and deep partisan rifts, formal processes currently usually break down. For example, if House and Senate are controlled by different parties, finding a common budget resolution at the beginning of the process through the formal steps of committee to floor to conference committee may be unrealistic. Then, when a budget crisis is imminent, the power elites, party leadership, congressional leadership, White House officials, may come to an agreement outside of the formal procedures of Congress. The result may be an amendment to an unrelated bill already on the way to being passed, or a continuing resolution being modified. See, for example, the 2013 Bipartisan Budget Act. In reality, no one sticks to timelines anymore, and the steps in the formal process outlined above are routinely circumnavigated to speed things up or make any progress possible at all. The US has bad institutions in general, for a democracy at least. It just becomes painfully apparent in the budget process when the stakes are high. Now we have reached the second slice of the executive sandwich bread around the congressional budget. Once the budget is passed, the executive has little control of the overall level. The Anti-Deficiency Act threatens harsh punishment for officials who try to fudge the numbers, and withholding appropriated money was what caused President Trump's first impeachment in 2019 and 2020. That's because the withholding happened for political ends, inducing Ukraine to investigate his political opponent Joe Biden, implying an abuse of the presidency's powers. The actual power of the executive at this stage is in the low-level implementation details of the funded programs. Congress can decide how much basic research should be funded, but individual decisions about which researcher receives grant money, which PhD thesis gets funded, or which pharmaceutical trial is funded are made within executive agencies. The total level of subsidies to a sector may be determined by Congress, but the president can influence or control which business plan actually gets supported, or where in the country geographically those funds may best be invested, within limits of course. The details of where personnel resources appropriated by Congress should go or not go are also executive decisions. Ultimately, how control here is split between the legislative and the executive branch depends on how detailed Congress's instructions were. They may even appropriate some amount of funds for a department, like state or defense, without any direction, simply to be used as the department sees fit. One control measure the White House can exercise over the rest of the bureaucracy that does not give it power vis-à-vis Congress are the so-called apportionments. Appropriated money is not just dumped into an agency's bank account. After appropriations are enacted, agencies submit spending plans to the OMB. OMB then distributes the appropriated funds, typically divided over time, for example quarterly, and by program or activity. That is the apportionment. And the Anti-Deficiency Act already mentioned prohibits agencies from obligating or spending money in excess of these apportionments. It's basically about OMB making sure all agencies are sticking to the budget plans of Congress and not over or maybe undershooting. OMB can apportion funds over time for legitimate programmatic reasons to match spending patterns, seasonal needs and so forth, but not to achieve policy ends like killing programs which may count as illegal impoundment. Impoundment being just any action by the executive to not spend money appropriated by Congress, including mere delays. This apportionment process is overseen by Congress's Government Accountability Office, GAO. The White House can also reprogram or transfer funds. Reprogramming is the shifting of funds within the same appropriations account, an agency moving money from one program activity to the other within its own budget. For example, moving funds for new computers into funds for new personnel. As mentioned, latitude here as well depends on how detailed Congress's appropriations bills were. Transfers, on the other hand, are shifts between different appropriations accounts, even between different agencies. Unless Congress's appropriations were very general or explicitly allowed for it, this will require congressional approval, unlike reprogramming, which can be done at will. While the individual agencies make these requests, all of this has to be cleared with OMB, so ultimately the White House is in control. Then there are rescissions and deferrals. Congress in 1974 didn't just create a new budget procedure, but also ended the president's ability to withhold funds unilaterally via the Impoundment Control Act. The act instead introduced those two categories of legally withholding funds. First, deferrals. They are easy to do, but for limited purposes. They don't require congressional approval, even though Congress can axe them, and they only last up to one fiscal year anyway. These are permissible only for unforeseen contingencies or efficiency improvements, not to change policy outcomes. Second, rescissions. These are harder to do, but have broader application. They require a rescissions bill from Congress, but they can then cancel funding completely and for any reason, even policy priorities. Returning to Trump's first impeachment, the Trump administration tried to use such a deferral to impound Ukraine aid in 2019 to avoid having to seek congressional approval first. They claimed this delay was in fact programmatic, that they were trying to determine the best way to run the program before spending the money. That kind of programmatic delay is indeed intended by the Impoundment Control Act as a valid reason for a deferral, falling under efficiency improvements. But since the deferral in this case was clearly politically motivated, the GAO disagreed and ultimately impeachment followed. Biden similarly deferred funds for Trump's wall, arguing that environmental review and stakeholder conversations were still necessary, and this time the GAO agreed. What counts as illegitimate political motivation and legitimate programmatic or efficiency-based motivation may be more a matter of argument than fact. In any case, the Trump deferral was clearly political and therefore illegal. The current administration tries to assert, well, let's say, unconventional unilateral executive authority over federal spending, harkening back to a time before the 1974 Impoundment Act. This includes more aggressive uses of OMB's apportionments and unilateral deferrals or cancellations. The administration, for example, tried to reduce the size of the federal bureaucracy by offering buyouts to civil servants. But this may violate the Anti-Deficiency Act, since these buyouts may obligate spending in the future that hasn't been appropriated yet by Congress. This is a complex and evolving subject, and if you're interested, you should read the freely available paper on appropriations presidentialism in the sources. What should stand out from all the details is that the budget is not simply one document created in a linear and predictable manner. When the government budgets, it is not like you at home keeping track of income and expenditures and thinking about where to spend less, where to spend more, and how much to work. Decisions about money are simply too highly political for a purely technical approach or a neat flowchart. Different centers of power have intense interest in the outcome of budget deliberations. Whatever legal procedure you establish will immediately be exploited by everyone involved to the greatest extent possible. Actual procedures are a mix of traditions, legal frameworks, and ad hoc agreements. Government's taxing and spending decisions are probably the most consequential decisions anyone makes on the planet, not just because the absolute sums are so large. Private corporations can also be worth trillions. What is qualitatively different is that governments are moving liquid cash around, not bound by market forces. Elon Musk does not literally have hundreds of billions of dollars at his disposal. His wealth is bound up in illiquid capital, already put to productive uses. If he wanted to significantly change something about the world, he would have to disassemble physical factories or turn them into something more liquid like money. Since his resources are currently used productively in the market, this very act would already diminish them. Even the richest capitalist is ultimately just another particle in the market. Government budgets represent the largest chasm between how important people think something is versus how important it actually is.